Great, so we'll start. First of all, welcome to all of you. We are so happy to welcome you here at DIIS for this extremely timely and relevant event on Russia's war in Ukraine and what it means for international order and the UN system. In the interest of time, I will not take up a lot of your time. My name is Maria-Louise. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. And I just want to mention that this event, today's event, is part of an ongoing collaboration between DIIS and the Danish Foreign Ministry, which aims to build knowledge around the UN nations' peace and security agenda, as well as prepare Denmark's candidature for a non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council in 25-26. And we actually have a very interesting event planned for Tuesday, next week, on climate security in some of Africa's climate hotspots. And you can find the details on DIIS's webpage. Before I give the floor to Elias, I will also just remind you that the event today is being live streamed and that we have a 15 minutes coffee break at 2:55 until 10 minutes past 3. And then I'll just give the word to Elias.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome everybody also from my end to this seminar on Russia's war in Ukraine. It's terrific to see so many people here in the audience today. I'll just make a few introductory remarks. First off, from the beginning, to be very clear, in this seminar, the purpose of the seminar is not to give a detailed discussion of sort of the latest week's developments on the battlefield. The purpose of the seminar is rather to take a step back and reflect on some of the underlying drivers and origins of this conflict, and then also to discuss and perhaps to speculate about the implications of this war for international politics more generally. Because I would argue, and feel free to disagree, but I would argue what we're currently witnessing is actually history in the making. Which is to say, if you're going to, and when you're going to pick up a history book in 100 or 200 years from now, I'm pretty sure that this conflict will be described as one of these, watershed moments, one of these turning points. Because I think you can make a good argument that this conflict will have significant implications for the European security order, but also for international politics more generally, among other things, the UN system. And these are, of course, very, very big questions and big topics. Unfortunately, we have two brilliant scholars and two brilliant speakers here today who will engage with these issues. And I will just very briefly introduce them in the order of appearance. First in line, we have Professor Neil MacFarlane, who retired 2 months ago from active service. So now it is officially Professor Emeritus MacFarlane from the University of Oxford. And Professor MacFarlane is currently in the process of relocating from Oxford to Boston. So you can already hear he's a pretty busy man. He will on the side then also take up, or you have already some sort of association with Harvard University. So we can also hear Professor MacFarlane is a very, very distinguished scholar, and he has worked for many years or even decades on the issue of security in the post-Soviet region. And he has a special focus on conflicts in the Caucasus area, but also on Russian foreign and security policy. So I think it's really hard to find anyone who is actually more qualified to reflect upon the ongoing conflict than Professor MacFarlane. And then our second speaker is actually no less distinguished. It's Professor Tony Brames Knudsen from the beautiful University of Aarhus. And Professor Knudsen comes at the topic from a slightly different angle, because he has sort of a background studying the legitimacy or illegitimacy of using force in international politics, and he focuses also very much on international organizations, specifically the UN system. And he has also published widely on these topics over the last few years, and is publishing, and his latest book just appeared this year, and has written down the title with a catchy title: Power Transition in Anarchical Society, Rising Powers, Institutional Change, and a New World Order. And I'm of course very curious to hear how Russia and Russia's war fits into this framework of a new world order. So I'm very, very, very keen to hear your take on that later on. Now, anyways, as you perhaps can sense, I'm very excited about the topic and about our two speakers, and I could go on and talking about their big achievements. But I think I will restrain myself and I will turn it over to them. So without any further ado, I'll now turn it over first to Professor MacFarlane. Professor MacFarlane, the floor is now yours.
It works better when it's turned on. Now, first of all, thank you, Elias, for that very kind introduction, and thanks for organizing this event. As I said this morning, I'm now retired. I used to have no time at all. Now, I have a lot of time, more time than I know what to do with. I'm sure that will change, but anyway, it's nice to be in Denmark. And thank you to the Defense College for the invitation, and thanks to DIIS for the venue and the hospitality here. Right. So I've actually typed this out because I just got off an airplane from Boston, and I'm not terribly good at extempore conversation at the moment. I would rather be sleeping. Anyway, the basic theme of this presentation is the implications of the crisis in Ukraine for international order and the United Nations. As I began this presentation, I was struck by an article in the New York Times by Stephen Erlanger entitled, "Blast in Poland Shows the Knife Edge Margin for Escalation." It was a good piece, clearly distinguishing the difference in nuclear affairs between accidents and escalation. Accidents are just in what happens by accident. The second, escalation, concerns rational decision in extreme circumstances. To put it another way, when you're losing at one level of a conflict, you might want to choose the conflict to move to a different level. I'll get back to that later. But the title shows just how serious the topic is for international stability and order. I agree with Elias on this point. So too does the liberation of Kherson most recently, where victory was followed rapidly by a deluge of accusations of Russian violation of international law concerning the immunities of civilian populations. They are just the latest episode in terms of those violations with regard to Ukraine. And the other thing of note here is Russia's strategy of long-range bombardment of Ukrainian cities and the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which is essentially done not because of the necessities of war, but because of an effort to target civilian populations to make them suffer, so their support for the conflict will deteriorate. I'll begin with the war itself and then go on to a brief discussion of why Russia did this. The bulk of the presentation will focus on implications of the war for international order, brackets here, whatever that is, and brackets, and I'll conclude with a couple of remarks on prospects for resolution of the conflict. Now, concerning the war itself, I agree with Elias, there's no point in a detailed account of the development of the conflict. I assume you all know that evolution. Instead, I'll draw a few general points out of the experience of the war and what it suggests about military affairs. First of all, for many who follow these things, the war itself was a surprise. Academics are not supposed to be surprised. This one surprised us. It's odd. To me, that is odd, given that the war actually began in 2014 and not in 2022. It began with Russia's annexation of Crimea and intervention in support of separatists in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. In a sense, Russia's attack of February 2022 was a continuation and escalation of a long-standing military engagement on Ukrainian territory. Moreover, in the longer span of time, the attack on Ukraine was consistent with a broader policy that Russia has within its own region that clearly began with Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. So we're basically about 15 years into this conflict rather than 15 months into this conflict. The course of the war was also surprising to many. You may recall that the general expectation in the early days of the conflict was a quick Russian victory. Russia is bigger in territory and in population. It has a much more substantial and better equipped military. It had seemingly adopted the combined arms operation of small units who were highly mobile, using artillery, air, infantry together in a coordinated fashion. In other words, they were adopting what in American parlance is called shock and awe. The point is that most measures of power ignore levels of commitment on the part of participants. I'm reminded of a comment by a Ukrainian soldier in April of this year. He said, "The Russian soldiers don't know where they are, and they don't know what they're fighting for. We know where we are. We are fighting for our land, and we know what we are fighting for, our identity." This is a useful insight. There's a long series historically of defeats of major powers by small states or rebel movements whose fighters are more motivated. France in its colonial wars, US interventions in Vietnam, and more recently Somalia and Afghanistan, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, all of these were major powers trying to take control of small places. They all failed. In all of these cases, popular will prevailed over material power. My fourth point here is that the war as it is being conducted in Ukraine is very retro. It's not the way we saw war was likely to be. Despite the addition of drones and cyber war capabilities, those are news, the war has boiled down to a rather traditional mode of 19th and early 20th century war, using artillery, massed armor, and massed infantry, generally positioned in trenches. This is also important because after the end of the war, Western military planners concluded that there was no need for that range of capabilities. They could instead move towards peacekeeping and conflict management in the context of a general belief in a future that was peaceful and where the occasional eruption could be dealt with through multilateral efforts at conflict management. That the requirements for those operations are light and mobile forces, and they usually face adversaries who are smaller and less capable. Now, we assumed out of arrogance that since this was the way of what we saw as the way of the future, it was reality. The Russian elite, in contrast, has moved back towards 19th century and early 20th century understandings of international relations. After a flirtation with the post-Cold War peace under Boris Yeltsin, they gradually reverted to the more realist conception of international relations, which is basically that the strong do what they will, and the weak accept what they want, what they must accept, because if they don't, they'll get hurt. In this conflict, after their initial reversals with combined operations, the Russians have shifted back to the logic of World War I and World War II. I expect, by the way, this will turn out to be a mistake. At the local level, the front end of the Ukrainian army has been fighting that kind of war now in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine against Russia for 8 years. Their necessity, therefore, has hardened them. They are very good, creative, and adaptable soldiers managed by a very effective and well-established command. They are set against a Russian force that, although larger, is increasingly populated by recruits who have not been properly trained, do not know the terrain, are under-equipped and poorly commanded, and with a significant lack of coordination between units. The broader reason why this is important is that while we have been pursuing a liberal international order, as we call it, Russia is caught in a time warp with an essentially 19th century understanding of international order. That understanding of order is antithetical to the project which the CSCE and OSCE and all European states embraced in 1990, which was to create one Europe whole and free. Instead, As the outline says, the outline of this event, the Russian preference is for great power management, including spheres of influence. We may be moving back towards a bipolar Europe. It will also be a more heavily armed Europe than it has been, not only because Western supporters of Ukraine are seriously depleting their weapon stocks and in working towards assisting Ukraine, but also because of the re-emergence for the first time in 30 years of a major conventional threat in Europe that will require expansion in the size of NATO conventional forces in Europe, and bigger defense budgets. So why did the war occur? The first question is, who is responsible, or as the Russians would say, кто виноват? The quick answer is Russia. When we think about why states take decisions, major strategic decisions in foreign policy, the usual explanations are either in terms of a response to outside threats, or in response to domestic political pressures, or in response to leadership preferences. All three are important here. At the systemic level, it seems reasonably clear that Russian policymakers have long seen possible NATO eastward enlargement into the former Soviet space to be a serious, if not existential, threat to their country. Paradoxically, the lack of a substantial Western response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of Georgia, and the 2014 annexation of Crimea, or for that matter, the Russian engagement in Syria in 2015, the lack of a real response on the part of the West may have convinced the Russian government that significant Western response to a more substantial attack on Ukraine was unlikely. The failure of Western conventional deterrence, in other words, may have been a significant enabling factor in Russian decision-making. Russian domestic politics also played an important role here. In general, we think that we consider that domestic public opinion and political processes in the legislature and among governing elites can provide incentives or disincentives for external military action. Applying it to Russia, we note that the Russian political opposition has been more or less completely suppressed. Domestic public opinion is passive, or, given the degree of state control of media, supportive. The Russian political system is more or less completely subordinated to the leader, Vladimir Putin. This configuration domestically made it highly unlikely that the leader would meet any substantial domestic opposition to whatever agenda he chose to pursue in foreign policy. In this respect, conditions in domestic politics also serve to enable the decision to go to war or to escalate the war. That doesn't really explain why the decision to escalate was made. To me, the reason lies with the leader himself. The other levels of analysis suggest that the international and domestic risks he faced in undertaking the operation were tolerable. But why did he choose to do it in the first place? The answer takes us to discussion of his own individual preferences in regional and wider foreign policy. It is, of course, hard to know what's in an individual's minds, but it's hard to know what is real belief and what is mere posturing for political advantage. But to judge from his own statements since the early 2000s, he believes that as a great power, Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence in the former Soviet space. It is entitled to control its neighbors, whether or not they like it. And he believes that Ukraine has no claim to sovereign status in international relations. That is because, in his belief, Ukrainian land is Russian land, and Ukrainians have no independent nationality because they are Russian. Time is short, let's move to the international order. What are the implications of this for international order? Well, as I said in a session this morning, it's hard to draw implications about the future because the future is a different country. You know, we cannot know what has not yet happened. But we can draw inferences from what we know about the conflict and its international consequences so far. If, taking the concept of order, if we unpack order in the current system, we find it has different levels. We could be talking about international order broadly speaking, concerning the system as a whole, or we could be talking about regional order, such as European order or Asian order, and so on. Order also has a number of functional variants. There is a political order in international relations, an economic order, a legal and institutional order, a security order, and a nuclear order, to name but a few. In the discussion to follow, I have a few things to say about the European regional order. I'll continue with comment on the economic order. The bulk of this section will focus on the legal order and the United Nations. And I have a few concluding remarks about the nuclear order. On Europe, I touched upon this already. Concerning institutions, after the collapse of the USSR, NATO had a real problem. It had an alliance, but the alliance had no threat. In other words, it sort of lost its purpose, and it spent 30 years wandering around looking for a purpose. And finally, it found one, which, as it happens, is the old one, which is collective defense, because collective defense, after a long sabbatical, came back in the form of a Russian threat to Europe. So what do we see here? We see, for example, the impending admission of Finland and Sweden to the alliance. Despite their earlier objections or reservations about that admission of Finland and Sweden substantially expands NATO northeastwards, and it also expands NATO's military capabilities substantially because both Sweden and Finland have very effective, though somewhat smaller, military forces who all know how to work with NATO. Additionally, in terms of change in NATO, most members are taking their defense spending targets more seriously, which is good news for NATO, although it may be bad news for financing social welfare systems in European social democracies. In other words, if we spent 30 years taking the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, now the alliance is rearming. In the meantime, the US has dramatically increased its combat-ready deployment in Europe. The EU, having had the outline of a community security policy for years, this is the European Security and Defense Policy, is now putting real meat on the bones. How successful that will be is open to question, but at least the reemergence of the threat from the East has created a substantial discussion that appears to be widely supported by member states. The international economic order is a separate topic. I'll be very brief. The Ukraine war has had very significant effects on the global economy. The largest is in the energy sector. I don't need to explain that. Beyond that, we have serious problems in food supply globally, resulting from the instability in the shipment of grain and oil seeds from the Black Sea region. The combination contributes to rates of inflation throughout the global economy that are higher than at any time since the early 1990s. That, of course, provokes central banks to raise interest rates in order to combat inflation. This has serious consequences in the third world because, as you see American interest rates rise, the value of the dollar against other currencies rises. And since most debt in the South is denominated in dollars, it becomes much more expensive to service their debt. So there is an impending financial crisis in the third world coming out of this. The disruption of global food markets has also raised the prospect of famine through considerable portions of the Middle East and North Africa. There is no good news here for the international economic order. It is a mess, and it's becoming a worse mess. My major topic, and I realize I'm coming to the end of my time, despite the time that was expended in the introduction, I am counting. But in this context, we're talking here about the legal and institutional order. The viability of these frameworks is based on general compliance by all states, and particularly all major states. Specifically, the adherence of major powers to the principles and practices embodied in this order. The key legal aspects I focus on here are the prohibition on the aggressive use of force, respect for sovereignty, and respect for the territorial integrity of states. These are all charter principles in the UN Charter. Subsidiary aspects are the principle of non-intervention in international relations and the right of national self-determination. To state the obvious, Russia, without credible justification, has violated the prohibition on the aggressive use of force. It has violated the principle of territorial integrity, also with regard to Ukraine. In its denial of Ukrainian nationality, it has violated the principle of national self-determination. Another important element of the legal order is international humanitarian law. For example, the Geneva Convention's principles on the prohibition of targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure in war. The acceptance of the requirement to respect the integrity of populations civilian populations under occupation. The prohibition on torture and sexual violence. The immunity in war of medical personnel. Provision for the humane treatment of prisoners of war, and the prohibition of forced displacement of civilians. All of these have also been violated by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Now, don't get me wrong, Russia is neither the first nor the most frequent delinquent in terms of international humanitarian principles. There's a lot of bad behavior going on, and it's not just Russian. But to the extent that major players ignore the basic rules of international state practice, those rules are under threat, because violation of the rules invites emulation in the behavior. One country does it, another country thinks it's okay, they did, I'm okay with doing it. Russia has particular significance, as was suggested in the introduction, in this regard as a permanent veto-bearing member of the Security Council. This brings me to the UN. The fundamental purpose of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security and to respond collectively to threats to or breaches of the peace. That purpose is vested in the Security Council. The Security Council cannot act if a permanent member vetoes the action in question. This is where we are now in respect of the crisis in Ukraine. The Security Council is immobilized by a Russian veto. It could also be a Chinese veto, but that's a different project. But President Zelensky has commented here that the Security Council is ineffective and needs to be reformed. To those of us who spend a lot of time studying the UN system, this is not a great surprise or new insight. This has been true for years. He is not the first to suggest UN reform. But unfortunately, in order to reform the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council have to accept the reform. Russia is unlikely to accept measures that result in its loss of the veto power. Again, Russia is not alone. The same goes for China and the other 3 permanent members. No veto-bearing state likes to give away their veto. In the meantime, the UN General Assembly, where there is no veto power, has passed several resolutions concerning Ukraine by ever larger margins, effectively condemning Russia. The problem with the UN General Assembly is that It cannot do anything to implement these resolutions. It has no mandate. The mandate belongs to the Security Council. To continue this depressing litany, and I am getting to the end now, the UN is associated with two international courts with jurisdictions over many of the issues here: the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice has a rather poor record in addressing crimes of aggression. That is a long-lasting record. And in respect of the International Criminal Court, it bears mention that Russia has not adhered to the treaty that establishes it, the Rome Statute. So arguably, it's not subject to International Criminal Court jurisdiction anyway. I do not mean to dismiss the UN's relevance, not least because of the role that many of its specialized agencies are playing in responding to the crisis in Ukraine, to mitigate the human damage of this war. But frankly, the United Nations is failing in its principal task. It's hard to see, given the way the United Nations is organized and the way power is distributed within the organization, it's hard to see how it could fulfill its task in this instance. My final point here concerns the normative side of the global nuclear order. This has a treaty basis, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and an informal norm, which is a taboo on the use of nuclear weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was effectively a global bargain. The nuclear-armed states promised not to use nuclear weapons and to work towards system-wide disarmament concerning nuclear weapons. The non-nuclear states promised not to develop nuclear weapons. This regime, the non-proliferation regime, has been weakening for some time, not least because since states that are not party to the treaty have been developing nuclear weapons. And by the way, the taboo on nuclear use has a corollary in that which states that it is unacceptable to threaten as well as to use nuclear weapons. Russia has implicitly threatened to use nuclear weapons regarding Ukraine, and its military doctrine suggests that if Russia is facing an existential threat, it may, as a matter of necessity, use tactical nuclear devices. That implies an abandonment of the absolute no first use principle. I'll end now to leave time for my fellow speaker. And also to you, also time for coffee, and then also for you to actually have a dialogue with my colleague and I. Just to sum up, this is the most dangerous crisis in Europe since World War II. I agree in a broader sense that it is a system changer. It will not be the same as it has been over the last 30 years. It's possibly the most dangerous crisis in military affairs in the international system since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. I, for one, remember that, being of a certain age. I remember being trained in school at the age of 8 to hide under tables when the alarm bell rang. The crisis is already having significant negative impacts on the global political, economic, nuclear, and legal institutional orders. I was going to talk about the implications of a potential Ukrainian victory for international order, what prospects there are for peace negotiations concerning Ukraine, and the implications in the longer term. If Ukraine does win, we face a very old question concerning European order in particular, but also international order. What do you do with a major European state, that's to say Russia, that is isolated, alienated, disillusioned, and fundamentally hostile to the outcome. But I don't have time, so I can quickly avoid them and go and sit down. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, appears to be working. I would also like to thank the organizers wholeheartedly, Maria-Louise, Elias, and Jonas. Thanks so much for organizing this event, which is, of course, on a very serious and tragic background, but that does not make it less important to discuss the war and the consequences of it. So I'm going to give you my take on the reasons for the war, especially a major background reason for the war as I see it, and then the consequences for the international order, especially the legal order in the United Nations. And I think that it's important to go to the background causes, both to understand the war and its consequences. When Russia sent troops into Crimea and eastern Ukraine to help the liberation army there, to liberate these areas from Ukraine, as they saw it, and to annex Crimea, there was an immediate trigger, which was quite obvious to see. It was the association agreement, economic agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, which threatened, as seen from a Russian perspective, to take Ukraine away from Russia and the Russian sphere of influence and further towards the West. So it was easy to see how the annexation of Crimea and the military presence and civil war status in eastern Ukraine would prevent such things from happening. It was actually, seen from a Russian perspective, one should think, quite successful, insofar that it was impossible to see NATO include Ukraine in NATO or the European Union adopt Ukraine as a member as long as there was this kind of hostility and state of war. So why did they attack? Why did they launch a full-scale attack in 2022 on the 24th of February? Yeah, one could say that there was still a war going on, there had to be an end to it, but still it was striking that it was such a massive full-scale attack against Ukraine, apparently to take control over the entire country, either by inserting a proxy government or simply by annexing greater parts of the territory. Why did they make such a risky move, as it would seem to be? No matter the calculations, it was risky. It must have been seen as risky for Russia. It was without an immediate trigger, and it was utterly against international law, promising serious resistance towards Russia in the international community. So why did it do it? Why did Russia do this? My macro explanation, building on theory and history, would be that it was about power transition, meaning the processes that took Russia as a part of the Soviet Union away from a status as a full great power towards a lesser power. One could say a second-ranked power as compared especially to the United States, but increasingly also as compared to China. So Russia had experienced and increasingly complained a fall from this status as a full great power to a lesser or insignificant great power. At least sometimes that seemed to be the message put forward by Putin and Russia in general. Of course, military, Russia still had the huge atomic arsenal and also some power to project. But economically, Russia was comparable and is comparable to Italy. They have 170 million people, and they have less resources to put in a full-scale role as a great power. And the fact that China has catched up with the US in the meantime and is posed to overtake the US does not seem to make it any better for Russia. So in this interpretation, Russia has been experienced for the last decades a power transition which takes it away from its key position in international politics and towards a lesser position in which it would be subject to decisions taken by the United States and other power centers and to the rules put forward by the United States. one could say, to put it starkly, that Russia had become a rule taker rather than a rule maker. In terms of theory, power transition is extremely dangerous, and history partly supports that. The theory says that the rising power will be eager to define world order, the rules of world order, for the rest of the international society or system. And the falling power would be very, very desperate to stop its fall and to regain lost ground. So there would be a temptation for both rising and falling powers to use force. Historically, it has not always happened, but it has often happened. And I think one way of interpreting Russia's attack, full-scale attack on Ukraine, is to look at it from this power transition perspective. Putin has several times spoken about his dissatisfaction with unipolarity, with the so-called liberal world order, indicating that what he's really after is a big change in international politics and Russia's position in the international system or society. If we look at another theoretical take, John Mearsheimer's most recent take on the new world order and the end of the liberal world order, because according to many observers, the liberal world order is coming to an end, and some would argue it has already happened. Still, Russia is very dissatisfied with what they call the liberal world order. But if we look at the world order that comes after the one we have known, the so-called liberal world order, Mearsheimer argues that there would be two great powers capable of building up each their bounded order around them, not only regionally, but across the globe. China would be able to establish a bounded order, attaching a whole lot of states to China and the Chinese rule system and the Chinese leadership, and the US would be able to build a still liberal world order for a group of states on liberal rules, conditions, and with US leadership. Russia would still be a great power in a multipolar system because of Russia's nuclear forces and resources, which are still considerable, but they are not strong enough to have their own bounded order. And I think that is much to the dissatisfaction of Putin, who has not necessarily read Mearsheimer's work, but may be thinking along the same lines. Russia should also be able to build a bounded order. Russia should also have a sphere of influence. In any case, this means that Russia has been, and I think Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014, Syria 2015, and now Ukraine again this year, supports the image of a deeply dissatisfied and deeply revisionist great power, a falling power eager to change the course of history. And if you put it very starkly, you could argue that Putin is really going up against history. If this has succeeded, if he had been able to bring Ukraine under Russian sovereign control or political control, it would have been a massive success for Russia. Suddenly, again, making the idea of a larger sphere of influence possible, and also adding to the Russian power base, gaining Ukraine in one way or another. But this did not happen. Clearly, the war has failed for Russia, no matter how it ends. I guess it's almost hopeless to see for Russia how they could get such a victory. The most they can hope for now is some territorial gains. But that would not make Russia less revisionist. On the contrary, losing to one extent or another this war would presumably make Russia even more revisionist, unless there is a huge shock to the elite in Russia or a huge paralysis that would send Russia on the sidelines for some years. But the most likely outcome is that Russia will remain deeply dissatisfied and revisionist. So I'm back to Niels' question, how to get along with Russia in such a situation. One answer to that we already have seen. Clearly the Western calculation is that Russia must be counterbalanced. Even Russia think themselves that they are restoring a balance of power, trying to do it from a Western perspective. Aggression can never succeed in this way and must be counterbalanced. So one answer is clearly the balance of power. And I think the balance of power is actually working, potentially, in this situation. It will be difficult for Russia to continue this course after the end of the Ukraine war. But the other part of it would, of course, be diplomacy and institutions. And here I come to my argument about the international order, and especially the part of that that relates to the legal order, the UN Charter, and to the UN Security Council. Because we need to ask, what is it that Russia wants by using force again and again in recent years? What they look for in this argument is to maintain or restore their position. What they look for is status as a great power. What they look for is influence. And of course the UN system cannot offer them all that to the extent that Russia is asking for. But there is no international organization that can do it to the degree that the UN can. The UN system has institutionalized an image of great power management and a balance of power that belongs to 1945 and later decades, meaning that Russia is a full great power and a fully equal great power with a veto power in the UN Security Council. That gives them potential leverage. They can bargain, they can negotiate, and they can get status either by preventing steps from being taken or sometimes to negotiate steps to be taken by the UN. So I would rather turn it around and argue that after this war, Russia will have to return to other ways of becoming or staying a great power. One could be to try to do something about their terrible economy, but another could be to try to work in institutions. And here they would certainly maintain, as they have done constantly, that the UN Security Council is the only legitimate forum for decisions on intervention. And they are saying that even though they have just committed aggression, have violated international humanitarian law, had perhaps launched the most serious assault on the international legal order in many years. And I realize and agree, which I does now and back then, that the US attack on Iraq was also a serious blow to the international legal order. But the Russian attack on Ukraine is arguably even bigger and more alarming. But that does not mean that Russia does not like the UN system or the UN Charter, and certainly they like the UN Security Council. So they will still support the UN and its Security Council. And the worst outcome in the UN setting for Russia would be a situation in which the UN Security Council becomes irrelevant, because then their veto power will be no use anymore. Then their way to status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a veto right would no longer work. So there's a limit to how much they can destroy the UN system in years to come, to my view. What they can do in the UN Security Council is at least three things. They can be a status seeker. They can do bargains. They can do negotiations. They can try to do deals in the UN Security Council to maintain an image of Russia as an important great power, to get influence, and maybe get some recognition, which I think still they desperately want. Secondly, they can be a power balancing actor in the UN Security Council. We should remember that the UN Security Council deliberately reflect the balance of power as the whole collective security system was established, given the permanent powers a veto power. And it reflects the idea of great power management with special rights but also special duties for the great powers. But here in an institution where smaller powers also have influence as rotating members of the UN Security Council. So it is logical for great powers both to do deals and bargains in the Security Council and also sometimes to use the veto, especially if a resolution is put forward against the great power itself. That was the meaning by giving the great powers a veto. And of course it was grumblingly that smaller powers accepted it back at the conference in 45. But they finally sorted out that if we are to get the great powers on board on any limiting institution at all, they would require the veto power. And secondly, they realized, looking at the fate of the League of Nations in the interwar period, that if it was possible to turn the UN collective security system against a great power, that would be hopeless, because you could not launch resolutions that would imply a kind of a duty or the possibility of the rest of the world uniting against a great power because of nuclear weapons and the definition of great powers, at least an old one, that great powers are capable of resisting most of the rest of international society. So it would be impossible to put that load on the UN system, and therefore it was not done. That does not mean that the war is not terribly unfortunate for the international legal order and the UN Charter, because it is a great power with a special responsibility turning directly against the key principles of the international legal order. But it's only to say that I think Russia will continue to seek status by bargains and continue to balance by sometimes using the veto in the Security Council, making it important for these two reasons. There's the third possibility, of course, that Russia becomes a complete match spoiler in the UN Security Council, potentially aligning with China, if China would be up for that. But I don't think China would, because they have another interest. Everything is going for China. The more history unfolds, the stronger China gets, and the UN Security Council is a venue where they can get influence as a stronger and stronger state. So they also do not desire to destroy the UN system. So I don't think China would be a partner for Russia in a systematic attempt to match spoil what happens in the United Nations or its Security Council. It may be that there would be some kind of system in it on the so-called liberal world order. For instance, everything that would seem to promote democracy to non-democratic states, they would possibly veto every time it comes up. But here they would face other parts of the world, South America, Middle East, but especially perhaps African countries and African quarters. And for Africans, there is the anti-coup principle in parts of Africa. There's a principle of humanitarian intervention in the African way. So they cannot count on regional quarters like the African Union or ECOWAS in West Africa to support such anti-Western or anti-policies in all instances. Yeah, presumably the African Union, ECOWAS might even go outside the UN Security Council and not seek a mandate, which they did not for the intervention in Gambia in 2017. The great powers was not too sure that there should be a use of power by ECOWAS in Gambia, and they sent that message, but the Africans just did it anyway. So I don't think it's a road that will work for Russia. They may try, but I think it's more likely that quite soon Russia will try to return to normal in the UN setting. And then the question is, of course, whether other states would think that this can just happen like that after such an attack on the international legal order. Yes, that was my take on it, partly overlapping, but there was also some differences.
So thank you, Neil and Tony, for two excellent presentations, putting really the war in Ukraine into a bigger context. For your perfect time management, and the two presentations also, I think, provided a lot of food for thought. And speaking of food, some pastry will now be served down in the reception area, along with some soft drinks. No, it's soft drinks and coffee. Sorry about that. So we have now a 15 minutes break, if I'm not mistaken, right? And after that, we'll reconvene here and have a conversation about some of the issues that were raised in the two presentations. So it's a 15 minutes break, and we reconvene here at 10 past.
Yes. Dear Neil, dear Tony, thank you so much for your inspiring talks and interesting perspectives on this tragic event. Now we open up the floor to questions from the audience. And before stating your question, please tell us your name and affiliation so we know who we are talking with. Thank you. Yes, I have a first question.
Wait for the mic.
Okay, my name is Mrityunjay Mishra. I'm from India and I write for some newspapers. My question would be that, especially to the last two speakers, that why, if we take the other perspective, that what if Russia wins? The scenario that you pose is if Russia loses, then this will be the situation. And being from Asia, I see that Asian countries, including the one that I come from, have seen this as a great opportunity to get the energy from oil, gas, etc. From Russia. So there could be other ways for Russia to keep on the fight, and probably Europe might end up becoming poor, and then that way get divided. So what about the other scenario? And if you can enlighten us about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, please,
I'll start. Thank you very much for that question. I suppose the easy answer is to discount the scenario. That's to say, if Russia appears to be winning, Western aid will increase, and we will balance Russia until Russia finishes. Your point about the possible disunification of Europe and North Atlantic opinion on this subject is a very good point, because at some stage, this is an expensive operation. There are political groups, certainly in the United States and Canada, but also in parts of Europe, say, take Italy, who think that, wait a second, why are we spending all of this money on Ukraine when we could be spending it much better on, I don't know, roads or schools or teachers or social welfare? And so I think that there is a real risk that over time, as the budgetary consequences of Ukraine become more obvious to people, people will become less enthusiastic about defending democracy and the liberal world order. And by the way, speaking of the burdens, we're about 1/10 of the way there, because if, let's say, whether or not Russia wins or Ukraine wins, somebody is going to have to rebuild Ukraine. And the bill for that is probably at least 3 times the current bill for military assistance to Ukraine. So I think it's a very, very good question. The other element of what if Russia wins, I guess I would say, and I'm not being facetious here, it will be a lot easier for us to rebuild a relationship with Russia if they lose than if they win. Because if they win, how could any effort to normalize relations with Russia if they win is effectively endorsing a manifest and deep set of violations of international law, as well as the rights of the Ukrainian people. So anyway, that's all I have to say about it. Great question, though.
Thank you. Tony?
Yes, just short, so I can get this working.
It's on.
Okay, thanks so much. I thought I heard myself much better in the first session. But you can hear me? So I would say thanks for the question. Of course, both winning and losing can be defined in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And mostly we've been talking about Russia losing, but also that is up for discussion. Would keeping Crimea be losing? Haven't they already lost if they wanted much more? But of course, in the extreme case where they had been able to, or would be able to, control directly or indirectly all of Ukraine, it would have had massive consequences for Europe. It would have scared Germany, France, Britain, smaller states, because they would, of course, think which state is next, not believing that this would satisfy Russia's appetite for revisionism. And secondly, it would have been a massive loss for the non-aggression principle if this had succeeded in a way where larger parts of Ukraine had been annexed by Russia. But if you've been winning to a lesser extent or not losing, I also think it would be easier to build a relationship with Russia if there is quite a clear Russian defeat and then some agreement between Ukraine and Russia, because eventually only Ukrainian acceptance of some territorial change would pave the way back to normality.
It was not.
I thought so. That would be the only way back to normality. That would be that Ukraine eventually says that this change of borders is okay with us as a part of some deal. Remember that the UN resolutions, the UN General Assembly resolutions have said no state shall ever recognize Russian annexations in this country. So it is, at least by the General Assembly, deemed completely illegal. And the only thing that could change that would be a Ukrainian acceptance. Of course, another way to go forward would be that Russia delivers it all back. I guess there could be maybe ways to work up relations if it's Crimea. But it is as if all things are stalled until there's an end or a solution to this war. It's difficult to have the UN system working properly, the economic order, the political order.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
If I could just follow up very briefly on, there is, by the way, a third scenario between winning and losing, and that is a negotiated peace. Now, I'm afraid to say that that's the good news. The bad news is I'm really pessimistic about this possibility now, because for very simple reasons. If you look at the war aims of the two sides, they've been expressed over the past week again, and they don't really change. How do you get to a peace discussion? For Ukraine, the solution is, first of all, you remove all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. That includes, by the way, Crimea. Yeah. So this is a maximalist position. Russia has basically said, well, we're very much in favor of a negotiated settlement, and we don't understand why Ukraine isn't. All we need for a negotiated settlement is international recognition of the 4 annexations. Well, in my world, neither of those things is going to happen. So I think it's a long-term thing, and I think it's a long-term thing in part because of domestic pressures in both countries. I mean, essentially, in the Ukrainian case, if Zelensky said, okay, well, this has been fun, but I guess now we're just going to settle. They can have Crimea and maybe Donetsk, say, and we'll have the rest, and we'll call it peace. I would not want to hold his life insurance policy. He would be killed, literally killed, if he did that, because the people would turn against him. If the result of all of the sacrifices the Ukrainian people have been making since February 24th, 2022, is just canceled by a bunch of people, a bunch of men, by the way, sitting in a basement room with a pen, that has significant delegitimizing consequences. Likewise, for Russia, we think a lot about Ukraine's costs. We don't think much about Russia's costs. Now, and they are significant, and they will continue to be significant. Largely, so far, they've been financial. There's a modest economic impact from sanctions, but there's also a human cost. And the casualty rate of Russian forces in Ukraine is seemingly staggering. It's hard to know because they don't publish their data on this subject, but it's substantial, as is the Ukrainian one. And this is one way in which the dynamic of the conflict is entering domestic politics. It's mothers who have children coming home in coffins, which has been a problem in Russia in the past. It was a problem in the Afghanistan war. It was a problem in the Chechen war as well, where there were organized groups of parents of dead kids who say, well, why exactly did that happen? And we don't think it should happen anymore, which is, to my mind, a perfectly plausible notion. But in other words, the more dead Russians there are, the more difficult it will be, I think, to maintain the level of domestic support for the Russian campaign. And it would be certainly difficult for Russia to just back off and say, oh, well, yeah, we've probably lost about 80,000 or 50,000 young men's lives. But now we're just going to say, oh, well, this was a fun ride, but now we're getting off the train, and okay, so Ukraine can remain. It is almost impossible, in other words, for domestic political reasons, for either leader to accept the position of the other side. So it's going to be a long, long conflict, I'm sorry to say. That's my view.
If I just can weigh in on that question, give my 30 seconds take on it, because I think in a way, if you look at the European security order, I think in a way, and this sounds very strange to say, it doesn't really matter whether Russia wins or Ukraine wins, because I think the future of the European security order will be defined by a new Iron Curtain dividing the continent. And the question is just on which side of this curtain Ukraine will be, or to be rephrased that which parts of Ukraine will be on which side of this curtain. Because let's even say that now we go with the notion that Russia loses, whatever that means. I think it's really implausible to see any kind of scenario where Russia is going to be reintegrated into the European political, economic and security order. So in a way you can say no matter really how the war falls out, in the foreseeable future, in next years to come, I think that, that Europe will be divided by some sort of Iron Curtain as we had during the Cold War.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, we have a second question over here. No, yeah, the grey coat.
Thank you. My name is Carsten Paludan-Müller. I'm from University of Cambridge Heritage Research Centre. I was wondering about, as we see it now, Russia has been severely weakened by its engagement in Ukraine, and what we also see that Russia is not the only revanchist empire. We also have Turkey, and we have Iran with their own aspirations. So I was wondering, how do you see this as playing out, for instance, in the Caucasus and in Central Asia, where at least Turkey has major ambitions, and Iran at least has some ambitions regarding what used to be Iranian provinces in South Caucasus.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Let me take that one first, if that's okay, Tone. Thank you for the question, Karsten. Yes, revanchism seems to be a de la mode now. It's very much in fashion. And I would add China to this too. And that becomes relevant in the Central Asian case, where there is evidence of an increasing sort of incipient competition between China and Russia for influence in Central Asia. Because, of course, the Chinese also claim Central Asia for historical reasons. It's just that they go back about 1,500 years longer than Iran's, which go back, I guess, about 1,000 years before Turkey's, and 1,800 years before Russia's. So there are lots of competing claims. I think probably Mongolia could have a revanchist claim against on Central Asia, and for that matter, the Caucasus. But anyway, you're right. I mean, my take on this is there are competing claims for these states, but there are also common positions. They are revanchist with regard to a significant other globally, and that is the Western liberal order. And so I think my take on this is we've been talking about, or I should say, Elias has been talking about the falling of the Iron Curtain across Europe again, which I sort of agree with. But this is a regional point. We may be talking about a global point where, as Russia becomes more dependent on China economically, as the economic relations between Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey are all strengthening, not least because of sanctions against Iran, China, and Russia, you may be seeing the seeds of an alternative global structure of power which competes with the West, which, by the way, for reasons that I think the previous questioner alluded to, that might not be such a bad thing, but it's not very high on the list of greatest hits for Joe Biden, say.
Yeah, just very shortly, I agree with what you said, Neil. Earlier today we discussed the fact that, or at least the potential China has for taking advantage of Russia's weakening into Central Asia, and we discussed how Turkey had sort of gained influence and outcome in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia being unwilling or unable rather to support Armenia. So of course it comes with a price for Russia to be preoccupied in this war, which is very counterproductive to the argument that I made that they would like a power to stop the power transition. That would more accelerate the power transition, apparently. So it should be obvious at some point for Russia that they need to close this unfortunate road for themselves. But whether they can is a different matter.
Just one quick point on the question, because it was also interesting to see that you mentioned the three powers, I think Iran, China and Russia, sort of revisionist powers. I think what they have in common, what unites them, is the opposition to the West and the US-led liberal world order, right? But when you then zoom in on the regional level, you see that they have also overlapping spheres of influence and claims where they're competing with each other. For example, say again, Russia and China in Central Asia, or Iran and Russia, potentially at least in the South Caucasus, and perhaps also some parts of Central Asia. I'm thinking especially of Tajikistan. But that just means that, this is more, I think, a sort of a marriage of convenience at this point, I would say. That this is this conflict with the West that sort of keeps them together or unites them, although I think, again, whether or not China wholeheartedly supports the war in Russia's war in Ukraine, I think can also be questioned and discussed. But at the same time, again, on the regional level, we see tensions and potential conflict. So this, I think, will be very interesting to see how that plays out. And it's, I think, very difficult to make an assessment apart from right now, Russia is consuming all its political energy and actually its military capabilities in the conflict with Ukraine. And that means in Central Asia and the South Caucasus, where Russia used to be the security provider, the security guarantor, the hegemon in a way, well, they have, I think, lost some influence over the last couple of months. I think that is clearly to see already now.
If I could just make one last comment, it's what is it that brings these four countries, in terms of characteristics, what is it that brings Turkey, China, Iran, Russia together? One characteristic they all share is really substantial economic weakness now. And in the sense that China is having serious problems in maintaining output in the context of the zero COVID policy, but also serious consequences of American sanctions in particular on Chinese production and US import of Chinese production. Turkey has massive inflation and a really struggling economy. And Iran, well, we know the story of Iran. They're in the middle of a serious period of domestic violence, which is rooted in significant measure by the fact that the state is no longer capable of satisfying the aspirations of its own people. Part of that is the result of sanctions. So I have to say, in economic terms, this might well be a rather weak alliance of the weak.
It's true. Sorry, I know we're going on and on here, but just one quick comment on that, because we're talking a lot about these revisionist powers now, and as you mentioned, Iran, Russia, China, Turkey, perhaps even, and I just maybe I hang out too much with the Russian guys, but in the Russian narrative, in the Russian political discourse, who is the revisionist power there?
It's the US.
It's the US, exactly. That because they say since the end of the Cold War, basically, we, the Russians, have been on a back foot, and it's the West, led by the US, who is the revisionist power, who is trying to expand its sphere of influence, what we call liberal world order, right? Coming closer and closer to the Russian border. I'm not saying that they are so right or wrong here. I'm just saying in the Russian political discourse, and I think that probably also applies to other non-Western states, the West and the US is also perceived as a revisionist power. I think that is important to keep in mind when you analyze these political dynamics.
Yes. Thank you. So we have a question from the gentleman in the back. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. I am Erik Insula from Dialogue Forum. I have been working in the Soviet Union for 15 years and for many more years in Russia. I have been a manager of a rather great travel agency here in Copenhagen. Unfortunately, it has bankrupted due to the crisis in Ukraine. I want to thank you very much, all the speakers. And I am looking forward to a peaceful world. A peaceful world. It is horrible what is happening right now in Ukraine, and I still do not understand it, because it came as something from the air. I couldn't imagine things like that. But then, when you are speaking about Europe, will you please distinguish between EU, EC, and the rest of Europe? Because it is so, and that we have 27 countries in the European community, and we have 447 million inhabitants. It is 7% of the world's population. We cannot exist without having good friends all over the world, also in India, also in America, also in Russia, but we do not need war. If you look upon Europe, we are 11% of the world's population are living in Europe. We are 746 million inhabitants in Europe. And I think we can work together. And I hope we will solve our problems together without always calling for the help from America. America is a very poor country right now. They have a lot of problems inside and outside. And they are only 4% of the world. Is it really so that 4% of the world's population, or 329 million inhabitants, shall rule, shall tell me what I shall do, where I shall work, with whom I shall cooperate? It can't be the truth. We are saying 2022 now. Democracy is something else. We are not criticizing this two-particle dictatorship they have in America. We have to look forward. We have to trust on Europe and all the values in Europe. Yes, and that was actually what I wanted to say. After this, I shall say to my Indian colleague, 86% of the population in the world are saying, not Mr. Putin, he's not good enough, but what they are doing in Russia is good enough.
Is there a question somewhere, or
the question
a comment?
Is, why can't we cooperate in Europe? Why is it always EC against the rest of Europe?
Okay, thank you.
And I don't believe in any new walls.
That suffice. Thank you. So on a brief comment on collaboration in Europe.
Sure, I can take that very, very briefly. I mean, I think the questioner, Eric, he's right in raising the question about why does Europe keep relying on the US? Because, of course, in relying on the US, this is not free aid. It comes with political conditions. And to the extent that Europe truly wants to be free, it needs to loosen that connection. It probably shouldn't lose that connection. But the other point is that the reason this dependence of Europe on the United States has persisted steadily since the 1950s is that it is convenient for European leaders to have the United States pay for European security. And so, if Europe wants to be independent of the United States, and frankly, as a Canadian, I sympathize with that predisposition. Europe is a much better place to secure independence from the United States than Canada is, believe me. So we envy Europe in this regard, but it will require commitment, motivation, and resources from Europeans themselves.
Well, I'll just say I share the hope in Europe, and I share the view that Europe should be much more than the current European Union. It's so sad that this has happened, because I think for Russia, the natural place to look would actually be the rest of Europe, and the other way around, which also seemed to underlie to some stubborn German continuation of relations with Russia. But of course, that was on the same kind of calculation.
Thank you. So, do you still have a question? Yes?
My name is Christian, and I'm from Ordrup Gymnasium, and I'm a student. I would like to ask one of you, I can't remember exactly who, said that after this conflict, whether Ukraine wins or Russia wins, whatever, that means that Russia would kind of be excluded from Europe and the international of a Western community of a liberal world order. I would like to ask, why isn't it so that after the conflict, like West Germany after World War II, isn't it better in the interest of Europe to reintegrate Russia into the so-called liberal world order, and maybe also as a bulwark against, like the Chinese influence and so on? Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I go first?
Well, I could go first. That would be ideal, of course. But it's after aggression, it is very difficult to imagine any large-scale integration with Russia and for instance, the European Union or the West. This issue has to be solved, I believe. But I think that should be the main question for the West. How can we have also orderly and peaceful relations with Russia? And is there something that can be done, which is not to negotiate away Ukrainian territory, but something else that could be done, also economic deals, for instance? But it seems to be so far away from reality right now. But as everybody has agreed today, Russia will remain there and impossible to ignore for Europe. So something must be done.
Yeah. If I could add to that, I agree with that. I think that, put it this way, there have been periods of history where there was great tension between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union and Western Europe, and there have been periods of lesser tension. I prefer the periods of lesser tension because they're more peaceful. There's a specific point on integration, comparing West Germany and the fact that it was integrated quickly, comparatively quickly into Europe in the 1940s, as opposed to the possibility of isolation of Russia. Why does that have to be? I would note that I think that the answer there is not so the comparative question should not be Germany after World War II. It should be Germany after World War I. And the reason is that in after World War I, where Germany was more or less defeated, we refused to integrate Germany. We chose to punish Germany, and with one consequence of that was World War II. It was the experience of World War II that encouraged us to have a different approach, which was, Germany was thoroughly defeated. It was politically erased from the map of Europe, and the question was, what would you do afterwards with it? We decided to integrate the three Western zones into, first of all, the European coal and steel community, which then led to the Treaty of Rome, which then led to the EU treaty. We could do that because there was no state in West Germany to integrate except for the one we created in cooperation with liberal Germans, those few who were still remaining standing. Whereas in the case of Russia, I think everybody would agree that we are not going to fight Russia to the ground, destroy it as a state, and then rebuild it in our own image. That's not on. So it's a fundamentally different situation. Now, maybe if we had a massive systemic war in which we thoroughly defeated Russia, we might be able to do that. But I don't think that's going to happen, and if it did, we would not survive it anyway.
Yeah, probably true. Elias, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I can just briefly weigh in because I think I said that my assessment is that in the foreseeable future Europe will be divided by some sort of iron curtain. I certainly did not argue for it. I think just that it's the realistic outcome. If I was the king of the world and could decide what goes on here, I would certainly also argue and advance a proposition where Russia is sort of reintegrated with the rest of Europe and perhaps even the rest of the liberal world order. But just to follow up on Neil's point, or basically say the same thing as Neil just did, perhaps in slightly different words, it was, I think, a large part of the explanation why Germany could be so quickly integrated into the Western order was, first of all, it was thoroughly defeated, and the Allies could rebuild from scratch the domestic political system and, by the way, economic system in Germany. And second of all, the second conducive factor was, I think, that there was a big external other, which always helps to integrate. And this big external other at that point in time was the Soviet Union, right? So you had both a thoroughly defeated country and an external threat. And I think these two conditions together enabled and incentivized the Allies to quickly rebuild or help to rebuild Germany and then integrate it into the Western order. And I think you could make an argument perhaps that today we have also a big external other from a Western perspective, which now is China, right? But the first point, are we really going to thoroughly defeat and occupy Russia and then to rebuild the Russian political system from scratch? Ain't going to happen, right? So I think that is the key difference here between Germany, Second World War, and Russia today.
Thank you. We have a question from a distinguished gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Dwight Robinson, University of Copenhagen. Just zooming out from this conflict and looking at the situation in Taiwan, what lessons can policymakers, both in Beijing and in Washington, learn from Russia's invasion and the response that the West has to this situation? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. If you don't mind, I'll go very briefly first.
Please do.
I think that the question is, I'll focus on what is happening rather than what should we do. I mean, what we should do with Iran, with Taiwan, is to completely democratize China so that Taiwan could voluntarily join it. But for reasons similar to what Elias just said about Russia, we're not going to go there. So that might be optimal, but it's not available. But so what is happening, if you look at, take the United States at this moment, they are discussing the continuation and increase in American military and economic assistance to Ukraine in conjunction with a recommitment to America's its commitment to defend Taiwan in the event that China attacks it, and also to increase military aid to Taiwan. The problem with that, of course, is that the more aid Taiwan gets from the United States, the more committed the Chinese leadership is to destroying Taiwan. So, hey, I wanted to be short, I've been short.
Thank you. Me too.
I'll abstain.
Okay.
Abstain. Okay, I'll just then speculate. I mean, if I was a decision maker in Beijing and I would look at the conflict and the fallout of the conflict, I think, if anything, if I draw any lesson from this conflict, I would probably be slightly disincentivized to actually launch a large-scale attack to retake and reintegrate or reincorporate Taiwan. Because as we have seen now, the Russians face massive problems, first of all. So apparently it's not that easy actually just to sort of launch an invasion of a neighboring country and take it over, right? And second of all, I think at least the Russians were slightly surprised by the rather strong and unified response by the West, by the Western countries. At least they're funneling massive support into Ukraine, both financially and also militarily. right? So if that is any indication about the willingness of the West to support allies that are attacked, well, and this also applies to Taiwan, and I'm sitting in Beijing as a strategic national security advisor, I would rather say, okay, perhaps we should wait a few years with launching any major operations in and around Taiwan.
If I may follow up on this,
Certainly.
if I were an analyst sitting in Beijing, I would say we have to do it right now.
All right, here we go. So you can choose your favorite
Chinese analyst.
analyst
Yes.
here and then take it from there.
Yeah, if I can just briefly weigh in, I think one thing that has been pretty clear when been engaging with policymakers, also from the US, that is this simple lesson, right? Things are not always as they appear to be so, or appear so, and that both goes to military capabilities when they're actually put into action. I mean, what works, what doesn't work, and then of course what Clausewitz reminds us of, the fog of war, right? I mean, when the music is playing, who knows how things that will actually unfold. So I would recommend them reading some Clausewitz and then some Sun Tzu, right? Which recommend actually that you have half lost when you are engaged in the battle itself, right? So let's hope some of those insightful words from two fairly distinguished and elderly gentlemen that will settle in. Yeah. Okay, we have some more questions. One question here. Could you just give raise your arm if you have a question?
Hi, my name is Thor, and I'm also a student from Ordrup Gymnasium. And you talked earlier about the Security Council being immobilized and also about UN failing its tasks. So if we're talking about like the near future, what is next for the Western involvement in this conflict?
Yes, thank you.
We should ask our Danish friends on this one, because they're trying to join the Security Council, or you are trying to join the Security Council. Good luck to you. As a Canadian, I would say it's rare that you actually get there, but it's always interesting to try. But anyway, what is how do we sort the problem of the UN Security Council failing? I'm afraid I don't really have a constructive answer to this. I'm sure that Tony will solve this problem for me. All I can say is that the logical point in theory is to expand the membership of the UN Security Council further, and to not necessarily to remove the veto right of the permanent five, but to change it. I mean, essentially, in the charter, it was originally intended that permanent members of the Security Council should not have the right to veto resolutions of the Security Council which were aimed at them, which is exactly what Russia is doing now with respect to Ukraine. That would be one fairly simple change. You don't run into the same degree of opposition concerning getting rid of the veto amongst the permanent members of the Security Council, because you're not getting rid of the veto. You're making an exception so that if Russia attacks Ukraine, its veto would not count because it's a direct party to the conflict. But I don't think any of the permanent five would want that change either. So this is why I don't really have an answer.
My answer would be that the Security Council is not failing on, as I said, I don't think the Security Council is failing on this war, because it was never the intention that the Security Council should adopt resolutions, certainly not trying to enforce a great power into respecting the charter, because it was perceived to be hopeless. So you could, of course, change the system if the great powers would agree, which they wouldn't, of course. But in principle, you could change the system so that they did not have the veto power, or not if they were the aggressor themselves. But I think the calculation historically was that it would simply, there would be a huge risk that if the UN Security Council should turn against a great power, that great power would not accept the system or be part of the system any longer, just like it happened to some degree with the League of Nations in the interwar period. And if the great powers stop wanting to become members or be members of the Security Council, then the UN would fail. So, but I understand your the frustration behind your question. The other side of it is, of course, when genocide happens, and a great power simply obstructs steps taken to stop a genocide or crimes against humanity. And of course, the proposal that has been debated for some years is that you have a duty to at least explain your argument, so that you must come up with a reasoned position if you use the veto power. The other question of expanding the UN Security Council, I agree that the Security Council should be expanded, because the logic of it is that those who are great powers should be permanent members. And then you can discuss whether it's a good idea that they get in with a veto. But India really should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and so should probably a number of other countries, reflecting the changing distribution of power, because they are great powers anyway. And it's better to have the great powers in as a real great power with rights and duties, as stipulated in the charter, to have them out. So if that logic holds true, it's only a matter of time. But it seems to be a long time before, I mean, the sitting five have an interest in keeping out other great powers, apparently. Yep. But it is a threat towards the legitimacy of the United Nations in the long term if, for instance, India is kept out for the rest of this century.
Or Brazil.
Yeah.
Or Japan.
Certainly.
I just very briefly follow up. I don't really have anything substantial to say on the reform of the UN Security Council, but I think on your point that the UN Security Council is failing, and I totally sort of understand your sentiment, and I'm basically with you there. But I think you could also in a way turn it around and argue that exactly in a time of great power crises and conflict, the Security Council is more important than ever, because, you know, there are not many sort of channels of communication between, for example, the US and Russia, right? So it's perhaps a good idea actually that you have such a sort of a meeting place where the policymakers from the big powers meet once in a while and discuss problems, and obviously they will disagree, right? But perhaps once in a while they can also agree on something, and at the very least they can perhaps communicate with each other, and they can prevent misunderstandings or miscommunications, right? It's especially important when you think about the nuclear dimension, right? So what you want to do, at the very least, you want to do your best to prevent any kind of miscalculations or miscommunication. And I think in that sense, the Security Council can still, and I agree, a minor role, but potentially a quite important one. So I think you could argue, even though there's a crisis and it's failing, it has not prevented the war, it's not really doing anything, it still plays a quite vital role, I would say.
And the footnote on this very good point would be concerning the arms control dimension, is that the UN is critical now because the bilateral mechanisms of exchange, or the bilateral treaty mechanisms between Russia and the rest of us, have all either collapsed or they're being suspended. A couple of weeks ago, there was supposed to be a meeting of the Joint Consultative Mechanism on bilateral arms control, nuclear arms control between Russia and the United States. The Russians didn't show up. Mm-hmm. So that channel is now gone for a time, anyway.
Thank you. We have another question. Okay.
Hi, I'm Emil, and I'm from the Danish Russian Association. And turning back to the question regarding US and China, some analysts have suggested that China might want to wait until invading Taiwan, only until the US has built up its own sourcing of micro semiconductor chips for computers, since Taiwan is currently supplying the US in a large scale, and only then China will invade Taiwan, because at this moment it would be too big of an interest for the US not to go in and interfere. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I do. I have thoughts on everything. I'm sorry to say. You're the victims. What can I say? But on that one, this presumes that American policy towards Taiwan is determined by economic interest. Certainly economic interest is important in the relationship, but I think it's deeper than that. In fact, it goes right back to nationalist China, Chiang Kai-shek and the Taiwan lobby in the US and its effect on American politics. Taiwan is not in the Congress quite at the level of Israel, in the sense that it doesn't matter effectively what America's economic interest in Israel is. If you say something bad about Israel in Congress, you're in real difficulty because of the influence that Israel has with members of Congress. Taiwan is not at that level, but there is a very broad basis of support for the American relationship with Taiwan in the Congress. And that emerged well before anybody thought of a microchip. And it will exist, for better or worse, it will exist once America is making all of its own microchips. So I'm not, I don't really have any personal stake in Taiwan. It's not what I do, what can I say? But I think that even without American support, the Chinese would have a rough time taking Taiwan, because it's a small people, large state issue, and the Taiwanese are very well armed, and the male population of Taiwan has universal conscription. They're all trained, and unlike some other countries where conscripted people do not get trained on how to fight, in Taiwan they are trained to fight, and they are trained to fight defensively, to defend their homeland. And
if you look at it from power transition theory, if I may once again, this is the case of a rising power, China, wanting to correct a historical injustice as they see it, whereas the falling power, the US, know that if they lose Taiwan, there would be no way they can maintain faith among their allies in the South China region, South China Sea region. So it will be very difficult and dangerous for the US to give up Taiwan. So I sincerely hope that the China would think like we normally expect China to think, that there's no haste. History is on our side. It was a big mistake by Xi, I believe, to announce that it must be in his time that the change in Taiwan's status is pushed through, because it's utterly dangerous, in my view. And that goes also back to the problem, the question you raised again, my last comment, I guess. The real problem for the UN is, of course, when great powers get aggressive. The US attacking Iraq, Russia attacking Ukraine. If China, it's a different story, I know, but still it would look like an aggression. That is great powers turning against the basic principles of the UN Charter. And that is very difficult to handle for any system in an anarchical society, which it remains as long as there's no world government. So it's really up to the great powers to a large extent.
Right. I just have a very quick comment, because I think it's a highly interesting question that you raise. I have not really sort of studied in any detail Taiwan-Chinese relations, but it seems to me that you are indicating that the U.S. support depends very heavily on economic reasons. Neil then laid out that there are also perhaps domestic political reasons why the U.S. is committed to Taiwan. And then Tony, you also then alluded there are perhaps geopolitical reasons. So I think there's also a geopolitical dimension here why the U.S. would want to support Taiwan. It's from a geopolitical point of view quite comfortable to have this unsinkable aircraft carrier just parked across from Chinese mainland, right? So I think there's also some geopolitical logic here at play, and some may even speculate that there might be perhaps even some ideological, ideational reason here at play. Something about democracies aligning with each other and liberal values and so on and so forth. I know that some people say this is just value window dressing and rhetoric, but there might be also something to it. But I mean, and if you then add up these different factors, you have economic reasons, okay, there might be not so strong. You have domestic political reasons, you have geopolitical reasons, and you may even have sort of ideological, ideational reasons. So I think that the US is currently and will be quite heavily committed to securing and defending Taiwan in the years ahead. That would be my assessment here.
Thank you so much. What an excellent point to conclude on China. So stay tuned for our next brief on China's role in the UN. No, just kidding. Thank you for excellent questions, and thank you to those of you who have followed us online. Please give Neil MacFarlane, Tony Knudsen, and our additional panelist, Elias Götz, a big hand of applause. Yes. And thank you to DIIS for housing us and providing the facilities, and thank you to the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for coming.